All right, I should be live now. I hope I'm audible, and it looks like everyone's here, so we'll start. Now, just to get an idea of where people currently stand, why don't we have an initial vote for the audience? So for the people watching the live stream on Facebook, if you agree with Huawei, type yes into the chat. If you agree with the Huawei ban, type yes. If you disagree with the ban, type no. And if you're unsure, type unsure into the chat. And Alex will tally up the votes for me while I do the introductions. So welcome again, everyone, to our first external speakers debate for the new term. And I thank you all for coming here. I'm your host, Sangeet. The motion for this debate is, should the UK have banned Huawei? On the side which supports the Huawei ban, we have Tim Loughton, who is the Conservative Member of Parliament for East Worthing and Shoreham. And joining Tim Loughton, we also have Dr. Tim Stevens, who is a Senior Lecturer in Global Security at King's College London. And with opposers to the Huawei ban, we have Simon Lacey, who is a Senior Lecturer in International Trade at Adelaide University. And he's also a former Huawei Vice President. Alongside Simon, we have Dr. Paul Dowland, who is an Associate Professor of Computing and Security at Edith Cowan University. So Alex, do we know what the initial votes are? Alex? Oh yeah, sure. So we're going to do this whole debate thing in 3 rounds. For round 1, what we'll do is we'll have each of the 4 speakers give a speech that can be up to 5 minutes long for why they believe that Huawei should or should not have been banned. And of course, each team will take turns to speak. So we'll have Simon go first, and then we'll have Tim Loughton, and then we'll have Dr. Tim, and then Dr. Stevens. So when you have 1 minute left, I'll bang my gavel once, and when you have run out of time, I'll bang it 3 times. And so with that, I'd like to invite Simon to start off the debate for us.
Thank you very much. So the government of the UK have, in their most recent decision on this important issue, decided to go against the findings and recommendations that resulted from the 2019 Future Telecoms Infrastructure Review, which essentially found that there was no reason to ban Chinese equipment vendors from the UK's 5G market, noting that any potential risks represented by these vendors could be mitigated with technical measures. I want to argue here that we need to have the intellectual honesty to concede that Huawei is the unfortunate target of a campaign launched by the United States and implemented by both itself and many of its proxies around the world to besmirch the company's reputation and to both deprive it of market share and the technological capability to continue making and selling products and solutions at the technical frontier. For the United Kingdom, there are a number of reasons why it should not ban Huawei, but instead opt for the more nuanced, pragmatic, and technologically sensible solution, which would be to admit it to the UK's 5G networks, subject to standard risk mitigation measures. Here, I would like to offer 3 such reasons. The first is because banning Huawei does nothing to enhance the cybersecurity or information security of the UK's telecommunications networks. This is a point already made by many cybersecurity experts and seems only logical given that most cybersecurity incidents take place via attack vectors that are essentially vendor and equipment agnostic, particularly those perpetrated due to lax security by companies and users. This is a line of argument that my colleague Paul Haskell-Dowland will elaborate upon in more technical detail. The second reason why the UK should not have banned Huawei is economics. As a number of operators, including BT and Vodafone, have articulated, Huawei makes not only the most price competitive, but also the most technologically advanced 5G equipment and solutions. So obliging these operators to resort to vendors that are more expensive and less capable will raise their costs in a competitive environment already characterized by high CapEx, high OpEx, and thin profit margins. Another related economic reason is that 5G is going to be a core foundational technology which will form the bedrock of the fourth industrial revolution and will thus be key to countries' manufacturing capabilities and their strategic economic positioning over the next decade. Some of the biggest manufacturing powers at the moment, such as China, Korea, and Germany, are pushing ahead at full steam to adopt 5G technologies and build out the accompanying ecosystem. By banning Huawei, the United Kingdom will inevitably delay this important step in its own economic transformation, thereby putting it at a long-term systemic competitive disadvantage. Yet another reason is due to the UK's international legal obligations, particularly as a WTO member. By singling out vendors from one single country and one country alone, specifically another WTO member, China, and essentially banning these vendors from the UK market, the UK has committed a breach of its WTO obligations, particularly non-discrimination, the ban on quantitative restrictions, and the ban on technical regulations that are discriminatory and more trade restrictive than necessary. The notion that this violation could somehow be justified under the WTO's various security exceptions simply does not stand up to closer scrutiny, since these measures were not taken in a time of war or any other emergency in international relations, which they would need to have done in order to meet the criteria of the security exception. Let me conclude by positing that in the wake of both a messy divorce from its biggest trading partner, the European Union, and a crippling economic crisis brought about by COVID-19, coming late to the 5G era because of the self-inflicted wound of a ban against the most technologically advanced and cost-competitive vendor in this space is something that businesses and consumers in the United Kingdom simply cannot afford. Boris Johnson's government needs to recognise that it is caught in the crossfire of and risks becoming collateral damage in an international geopolitical dispute between the world's only remaining superpower, the United States, and an emerging regional power, China, and that the UK has nothing to gain and so much to lose by conceding to short-term US political pressure in a presidential election year on an issue of critical importance to the UK's long-term future economic competitiveness. Thank you.
Sangeet, your
microphone is off. I just realized. Thank you, Simon. I would now like to invite Tim Loughton to open up his half of the debate. Whenever you're ready, Tim.
Sangeet, thank you very much, and thank you to Southampton for organising this. I'm biased. I chair the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Tibet. I've been a long-time supporter on Tibet, so I know what China is capable of and what it's done to suppress a large part of its population on the Tibetan plateau, and what we're seeing as the continued complete Sinicization of the Tibetan plateau and repression of that culture and those people. We've seen recently what is happening in Hong Kong and the Chinese completely reneging on the Anglo-Chinese agreement and the suppression of free speech and demonstration in that country. We know what's happening with the Uyghurs now, effectively under UN convention terms, could be classed as genocide, and the concentration camps now the forced sterilization. And now we have mass protests amongst the ethnic Mongolian population facing their abolition of their own culture as well. We know what China is capable of. China needs to be called out and held accountable in the international community. So why Huawei in particular? And just to pick up on one of the points from Simon Lacey, if there's a strong argument for adopting Huawei's technology purely because it's the most price competitive, on the same basis, China offered to build HS2 for at least half of the cost that we are going to need to build it. I don't want HS2, and I certainly don't want the Chinese building it on the cheap with all the dodgy labour practices and environmental standards that would entail, as we have seen in Tibet, where they're busy wrecking the environment for the whole planet there. Huawei has provided sophisticated computing and big data services to authorities in the Xinjiang region where the Uyghurs are. There's an extensive network of surveillance and control helping the incarceration of the Uyghurs in those camps. And despite denials, there's a report from Australia's Strategic Policy Institute's Cyber Policy Centre that showed that the Huawei is working with the Karamay Police Department, with Public Security Bureau of Aksu on data centre, in Urumqi on establishing intelligence security industry, and in the Xinjiang broadcast and television network on a cooperative project whose goals include, I quote, creating a good public opinion for achieving Xinjiang's general goals of social stability. So Huawei is absolutely part of the Chinese establishment. The ownership of Huawei absolutely comes back to the Chinese government. 99% owned by the Huawei Investment and Holding Company Trade Union Committee, who are beholden to the Chinese Communist Party. So it is absolutely right that we need to be very skeptical about the involvement of Huawei in any major projects in the UK. So when at the beginning of this year, Huawei was deemed to be a high-risk vendor, it is appropriate that we should have revisited and scrutinized their involvement in the 5G project. And when the National Cybersecurity Centre changed its view and concluded that the best way to secure our network is for operators to stop using new Huawei equipment to build the UK's future 5G network, we need to listen. And I think that was absolutely the right action to take. It was action that's already been taken in the US and by other Five Eyes partners, in particular Australia and New Zealand. I know that the Chinese government, through Chinese businesses such as Huawei, have been buying influence in British boardrooms, on British campuses, and in British schools, employing respectable captains of industry at £100,000 non-exec director salaries a pop to proselytize for Huawei and Chinese expansion. I'm particularly concerned about the influence of Confucius institutes. I believe that Southampton University has one. I might want to investigate more into the influence that it's flexing on campus as well. So this isn't just an economic argument. This is, should we have big players like Huawei beholden to the Chinese government, whose technology has been used for suppression of rights and free speech and various other things within China and increasingly beyond Chinese boundaries as well? Do we want them having a major role in the next generation of telecommunications in the United Kingdom? And I think the answer is quite clearly not. And if you stand with the people of Tibet, if you stand with the people of Hong Kong, and if you stand with the Uyghurs who are having their culture obliterated, then you do not want to be supporting, and you need to stand up to Huawei and the Chinese government and its state-controlled firms. And that's why I think the decision was right.
Thank you, Tim, for that fine speech. And I was going to invite Dr. Paul for the next one, but he seems to have left. So in that case, I'll invite Dr. Tim to present his case.
Yes, thank you. I find there's a lot to agree with in both of the previous speakers, both pro and con the motion. The motion says, should the UK have banned Huawei? And I think we can find a whole range of issues, as articulated by my colleagues here, for why we should have done, why we should not have done. Simon raises the very cogent point that maybe the UK is just playing for short-term political favour with the United States here. I would disagree with that. I'd say it's currying long-term political favour with the United States. And let's not forget that we should be asking the question, why now, when we think about Huawei? For years, I mean, best part of 10 years, we've had the Huawei Cybersecurity Evaluation Centre, which has been raising occasional red flags with respect to the technical components of Huawei kit in the UK telecoms infrastructure. The first questions about Huawei were raised in 2003 when it became part of BT's, or British Telecom's, 21st Century Network, 21CN. We've been talking about this for a very long time, and personally, I've been talking about Huawei for about 10 years as well. So why now? Well, the reason is the UK has been put in a position that it did not request, it does not like, but it has to deal with. This is not a problem of the UK's own making. The UK has taken a risk management perspective to Huawei for a very long time now. And it's been put in this position because, as Simon rightly says, an escalating trade war between the US and China. It's in a rather unenviable position. It's trying to please both the United States, which is its long-term strategic ally, and also China, which is what it would like China to be a source of direct foreign investment and the like in the UK economy. So it's trying to play both sides of this, and it can't. It had to make a choice, and much like in any other war, metaphorical or otherwise, the US has put it in a position by saying, you need to be with us or against us. And the UK has voted to go with the United States on this occasion. And also, of course, to go with, if you're a Tory government, a rather large number of its backbenchers, who are rather hawkish in a way that I'm not on this issue, but I'm sure Tim would know exactly who I'm talking about. So the question about should the UK have banned Huawei, you can make all sorts of arguments around foreign policy. Yes, it's concerned what's happening in Xinjiang and Hong Kong and elsewhere, but that was okay up until about 6 months ago, and now it's not okay, because the US has essentially said you're either with us or against us, and the UK has chosen to go with the US. So should the UK ban Huawei? Yes, it's a normative question, but it's also a practical, realist question of, do you ditch your long-term strategic ally? Do you ditch your colleague in the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network? Or do you go with the Chinese, who do have some problems around human rights, trade practices, and so on? And they had to make a choice. So should they have banned Huawei? I don't think they had an option in this. Because it was to preserve their long-term strategic interests that they have done so. And I think there's another factor here, and I'll close with this, is that despite the fact that the US trade war with China might be rather more ideological than pragmatic, should we say, I think the UK is going to find it much easier to deal in the short term with an ideologically driven US, and it can deal with an ideological US as a cultural, historical ally, but I think it's hedging its bets slightly by thinking in long term, China might act if the internal politics of the US and China continue the way that they are. So let's fix this US issue for now, and we'll deal with the Chinese later. And I think when you think through those geopolitical lens, it might be a very narrow view on the issue, I grant you, but I don't think the UK had a choice. And I think for now it's made the right decision, notwithstanding all the other issues that accrue as well, as Simon has very well articulated. So I'm going to close there, but I do support the motion, although I fully concede that it's not a black and white issue. But I do think the UK made the right political call on this occasion. That may change.
Thank you, Dr. Tim, for your speech. And it looks like Dr. Paul is having some technical difficulties, but he is trying to come back. So in the meantime, why don't I ask you some of the questions I've received from the audience so far? So would I be able to just respond maybe in 2 minutes to some of the points that were raised by the other team, particularly the Right Honourable Member for East Worthing and Shoreham and Dr. Tim. Oh, is that right? Sorry, Dr. Stephen. Dr. Stephen. Yeah, of course. Look, just on Xinjiang. I mean, I understand certain empathy towards China's position on Tibet and Hong Kong. Although I think, having lived in China myself and having gone to Hong Kong on many occasions,
it is more complicated than it's being portrayed by the international media. But specifically in relation to Xinjiang, I mean, we actually don't have any reliable information on what's happening in Xinjiang. And just because, a very right-wing think tank in Australia funded by the US defense establishment says that genocide is going on, that doesn't mean that that's necessarily the case. So we don't really know what's happening in Xinjiang. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence. There's a lot of speculation. And we certainly don't know the extent to which Huawei's products and solutions are being used there. And the reason we don't know is because not even the chief cybersecurity officer was able to clarify to what extent our products and services were being used in Xinjiang when that issue came up before a parliamentary inquiry in the UK. But I'd also like to point out that, there are other companies. Let's take Boeing, for example. I mean, Boeing is a fantastic company, but it's the company behind the US government's military drone program, which has come to be widely used in Afghanistan and in other military theaters. And as of 2019, more civilians have died at the hands of NATO-led troops in Afghanistan than at the hands of the Taliban, whereby Boeing's military drones have played an instrumental role. And does this mean that we should ban Boeing from selling planes to our markets? I just don't think it's that clear cut. I could go on, but I'll just bring up the issue of the UK not really having a choice about going with the US on this one. Look, I think, whether this is a short-term or a long-term decision or long-term interest or short-term interest, and I think the UK could have pushed back. I mean, if you remember back to the Edward Snowden revelations, there was a high degree of dependency between the NSA and GCHQ. And if the UK had decided to stand its ground against, what's clearly a largely fabricated, completely ideological and completely techno-nationalistic campaign launched by the US, the US would have been constrained in the extent that it was able to push back. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. I could talk about the weakness of the US's case against Huawei, but I'll defer to responding to some of the questions of your viewers or our viewers.
All right, thank you, Simon. Does Team Tim want to respond to anything that Simon said right there?
You don't have to be called Tim to oppose Huawei, just to make it clear to your voters as well in all of this. I'm quite perfectly happy for Simon to have extra time, given that his partner has been fallen foul of technology. Just to pick up on a couple of points, I don't think the Boeing analogy is right. I mean, Boeing is not directly or indirectly owned by the American government or any government. It is owned by shareholders, and whilst they may have undue influence by certain governments who are providing their defence contracts, that's a very different situation to effectively Huawei's relationship with the Chinese Communist Party government. And I think, as other Tim said, that the national intelligence law in China, which came in 2017, compels China-based companies to support, assist in, and cooperate in national intelligence work. Although we have a lot of controversy around accessibility to social media companies' data, for example, we don't have that sort of compunction on companies operating in the UK or the US or Australia or other parts of the West at all. So I think the Boeing analogy is just completely wrong. Just in terms of, Tim also made a point about until 6 months ago, the whole case around human rights was rather different. Well, many of us who have been very suspicious about Huawei and other ciphers of the Chinese government have been calling them out for many, many years, based on their paranoia around anything to do with Tibet, or when the Dalai Lama visits the UK or any countries, and then the pressure that is put on those companies not to have anything to do with Tibet, with the Dalai Lama or whatever, goes way beyond anything that is reasonable. And another point, just in terms of American foreign policy at the moment, what's been interesting is that the legislation that has gone through Congress, the Tibet Reciprocal Access Bill, where I'm trying to get an equivalent bill through the British Parliament at the moment. This is about making sure that if you deny access to look at human rights abuses in Tibet, then those Chinese officials won't be allowed access to the US or the UK or whatever. And then the Tibetan Policy and Support Act, which went through at the beginning of this year, has gone through absolutely, almost unanimously, with cross-party support, right from the right, backed by Mark Rubero for the Republicans, through to Jim McGovern for the Democrats. This is not just some feature of the current makeup of politics in the States or the current preferences of the current president. This has been felt for some time within mainstream US politics, and there's an emerging consensus as well within the UK Parliament, not just within the Conservative Party, but increasingly from Labour Party members as well. And now there's the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which is bringing together democratically elected politicians, of which I'm a member, from around different countries, to call out some of these abuses by China, of which what's going on in Hong Kong and the influence of Huawei are just but two. We better go back to Paul before we lose him again, hadn't we?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Dr. Paul, would you like to present your case?
So my apologies, I've been having a variety of issues at my end. I'd like to say that I'm connected to Huawei technology and it's working perfectly. I'm sure the network has got its own problems without needing to worry about other vendors. So I've been listening to the comments. A few of them I was able to pick up on Facebook on my mobile to listen into some of the discussion. So I think that what Simon introduced a little bit earlier was a perfectly good set of points in the geopolitical situation and the concerns with regards to access to technologies. And I think I'd like to focus mainly on cybersecurity. It's clearly the underlying concern that's been presented here. And what we've seen is really bullying behaviours from the US and sort of exerted by their allies in relation to locking Huawei out of these commercial opportunities. And a lot of it is really off the basis of the national security concern. And we haven't really seen any kind of legitimate presentation of fact what the underlying issue here actually is. So there's the rhetoric about the Chinese Communist Party and the concerns of exposure to data and the ability for influence through the. But even that evidence, when presented to those in privileged positions, has not been sufficient to sway opinions. So it would seem that there is a disconnect between the perception of a national security concern in relation to the deployment of Huawei technology and the actual realization of those threats. And whilst there may well be legitimate concerns in relation to the Chinese Communist Party and their influence, is that really any difference to we see in the US and their exports and imports and their abilities to influence the supply chain? And we've seen examples there through the Snowden revelations in relation to access to exports of Cisco platforms, and the malware or malicious controls into what should be these controlled legitimate, and that they are targeting very specific groups for very specific purposes, and perhaps with a greater level of legislation and control than we might assume would be the case within China. That evidence simply hasn't been presented against the Chinese organization Huawei that's at risk here. There are others as well, and there is continued discussion about sanctions against the brand, I think it's ZTE, who has also been named as being of great concern in the exportation of particularly telecommunications. And when we look at the various legislation that's been put out and the recommendations that have come, a lot of these fly in the face of the recommendations from even the UK's own telecommunications supply chain review, which identified that such bans don't improve security and that in themselves can harm the national security simply by reduction in competition. And so locking out these major vendors who've made a very clear statement in favour of transparency, in favour of cyber security, seems to be at odds with the only viable competitors having no real commitment to cyber security and certainly not exposing their platforms to the kind of scrutiny that we've now seen with Huawei. It's a very one-sided argument, and we're not really seeing any responses on these matters. So I think, as Simon sort of indicated in his introduction, in his first point, the move to exclude Huawei from not just the future contracts, but also the removal of the existing infrastructure is inevitably going to result in certainly less reliant, probably less secure, potentially slower 5G networks, and that will have significant economic impact on countries, and potentially could introduce significant cyber issues, especially as we start the interoperability with less advanced and less technologically capable platforms, and China is not the only perceived aggressor in this particular war, because we do consider this to be a form of warfare. And are we simply opening up a fresh set of opportunities for a fresh set of attackers? That's the flavour of the month at the moment. I apologise if I missed the first gavel there.
That's fine, that's fine. So would anyone like to respond to what Dr. Paul has said there?
Can I just say a couple of things? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Paul. I think what has always struck me about this particular Huawei issue is that the discussions we have about to ban or not to ban are not cybersecurity issues. These are political issues writ large. And the UK ban is in part a response to domestic political voices. And as the Right Honourable MP, Member for Parliament, has rightly pointed out, one of the things about this debate is that the UK is not a singular entity. There are lots of different voices happening behind the scenes, as there are in the United States, and indeed as there are in China, for those of you aware of how Chinese politics works. The UK's decision in this case, though, was taken at cabinet level, presumably ultimately by the Prime Minister himself. So this is ultimately a political issue with a very, very small group of people that have taken the decision. The UK as a whole has not done this, but we must respect the fact that there are other voices in the UK, many of whom making the points that those opposing the motion would make. And those are valid arguments. I mean, one wonders how the UK is going to be able to plug that gap in its 5G infrastructure, given it's made electoral promises to roll out broadband, not just to rural and urban communities of particular speed and particular quality. How is it going to do that? We do not have the domestic industrial capacity to replace that vendor. And how is the UK going to square that away? But this is all about a political decision. And Simon, you suggested that the UK could have pushed back on the US. Well, it has been doing that for a very, very long time. Just as there are multiple voices in the UK, there are multiple voices in the US, and there have been untold numbers of congressional committees and reports in Washington, D.C. for many, many years that have been pushing various US administrations, we go back quite some time, to ban Huawei, to censure companies like ZTE, which Paul mentioned, and the like. And even the the White House has pushed back on those as well. But ultimately, it's come to the point where the UK, the Prime Minister, is being asked to make a decision between a strategic military ally and a foreign investor. And it's made the decision to go with its historical partner. But the UK, up to that point, did push back on the United States. It has done so for a very long time. The whole setting up of the Huawei Cybersecurity Evaluation Center many years ago was a pushback against the United States. It was going, no, we're not going to ban Huawei. We're going to try and work with it. We're going to allow it into our networks. We're going to manage the risk. And it's the US sanctions that have made the UK intelligence community turn around and say, we can no longer manage the risk in the supply chain. At that level, it is a cybersecurity issue, but ultimately the decision has to come from the Prime Minister, or at least from the Cabinet. And that's ultimately what's happened. It's a Hobson's choice. I'll grant you that. It's a choice between two evils, and then there's no obvious side to come down on here, but ultimately it is a political decision. And Paul, I buy your cybersecurity argument, but that's not the main argument, I would argue, in this particular debate.
Can I respond to a few of the things that were said there by Tim Stevens and Tim Loughton? Would that be okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Simon.
Look, I really share the Right Honourable Member for East Worthing and Shoreham's concerns about Tibet, and I think, you know, we all realise just how prickly the Chinese regime is when it comes to issues of Tibet and the Dalai Lama. And it's very unfortunate and very self-defeating, their reaction on this issue. But I don't really see why we need to lay that at the door of Huawei. I mean, this idea that Huawei is somehow enthralled to or owned by or controlled by the Chinese state just doesn't hold up to closer scrutiny. And in fact, I mean, this line of argument just lacks any sophisticated understanding of how the Chinese private sector works and how the CCP choose to intervene in the Chinese economy. So Huawei, like any other big company operating in China, which would also include companies like Microsoft, by the way, need to show that at a very sort of general level, their corporate objectives are broadly aligned with the national economic objectives of the Chinese leadership. But the notion that Huawei could somehow be press-ganged into providing actionable intelligence for the Chinese state security services against its customers or against its interests abroad belies the fact that if it were to do so, Huawei would be putting at risk its commercial relationships and its reputation with hundreds of operators and millions of customers in close to 180 countries and territories. And the Chinese leadership know this, so they would presumably use other methods to obtain the information they need rather than knocking at Huawei's door and thereby imperiling the prestige and commercial viability of one of the country's national champions. Another issue on the national intelligence law is that in 2018, I think it was, Huawei obtained a legal opinion from a respected Chinese law firm, which was reviewed and upheld by Clifford Chance in its underlying analysis. And it supported the company's contention that the 2017 national intelligence law did not compel it to support Chinese state security authorities outside of China. What should also be understood here is that many governments have similar and in some cases even more far-reaching legal obligations for their citizens and their companies on their statute books to cooperate, including in the United States, where the US Cloud Act compels companies like Microsoft to hand over data, also data held overseas. So I think I'd just like to add counter those points with that. I would also like to say, just in talking to the point made by Tim Stevens, Dr. Stevens, that, you know, congressional reports over many years have been advocating a ban on Huawei. Look, one of the first things I did when I joined Huawei in 2015 is I read these 2012 joint congressional committee reports, and really, as somebody who has a background in law, they read to me as in lacking any kind of clear evidence. It was all just speculation and no really hard evidence against any wrongdoing by the company. And when you say there was a choice in favor of a military political ally and on the one hand and an investor on the other, I mean, I can certainly see that. I can certainly understand that, but I think it was a false choice. because the whole thing about allies is that, it's a mutually supporting structure. I mean, the US showed in the war on terror that it wasn't ready to invade Iraq unless it had a number of allies with it. Otherwise, it would have looked like an unjustified invasion. And so, if the US's allies stand up to it and say, no, look, we just don't think there's any evidence here, and no evidence has been produced, I don't believe that that this is an area where the US's allies have so little autonomy and so little choice. So I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. So would anyone like to respond to what was said right there?
Very quickly, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, it is a false choice. Absolutely right. Yes, the evidence is thin, and it's always been thin. I've never seen a open and shut case against Huawei on any level, whether that's the technical level, whether it's the strategic level, whether you're talking about complicity with the Chinese Communist Party. You're absolutely right. But the fact is that the UK is a weak government in a very weak political position and in a very weak geopolitical position at present. And no matter what its self-image is within the Conservative Party with respect to the right honourable gentleman, I think we're in a weaker position now geopolitically than we have ever been as a nation. And the UK, under those circumstances, was given what some people will call a hospital pass. It's a pass that you don't want to take on the rugby field, but you have to take it knowing full well that there's going to be damage to yourself as a result. And it was going to lose one way or the other, and it's made the right political decision under exceptionally constraining political circumstances of a somewhat erratic US administration, of stresses and strains on the transatlantic alliance, of Brexit, and all sorts of other issues of which COVID has just compounded. So under those circumstances, I think it made the right political call, albeit a marginal one. And it was a false choice, but it was the choice that it was given.
Thank you, Tim. Would anyone like to respond to what was said?
Good. I'd just like to add to those comments. I mean, that was a really interesting perspective there, and obviously I missed some of the previous discussion. And I think that's a very showing or very telling interpretation of the situation in the UK. And obviously I'm a bit detached from that these days, being in Australia. But clearly there is a significant issue here in terms of the strength in the UK and the influence that the US is showing. And obviously you've flagged the various issues there with the US presidential elections. And is that in a way the UK is just rolling over and accepting this particular situation. And what would happen in the future if the perceived enemies and allies of the US change? So obviously we're seeing at the moment a particular political situation where China is the aggressor, and to a certain extent that's been the case for many years. But that is a changing situation, and allegiances do change. And I'm somewhat concerned at the idea that we would face a situation that the politics of the time and the particularly the political influences of the US are influencing such a significant technological rollout as the 5G network, and ultimately technologies that go beyond that. It wouldn't take very much for the US and the EU to further fall apart. They're already at odds on a whole variety of issues, and it's not beyond the possibility that the UK and the EU could recommence communications, and we could find ourselves in a very different situation. And I think it's very risky to be making those kind of decisions based on a particular allegiance at a particular time that effectively locks you out of a potentially global partner who at some point will gain favour on. I don't really have a positive or negative response to the statement, but I think it's just concerning that we're risking so much on such a flimsy relationship, because that special relationship with the US is no longer as special as it once was.
Can I just use some of my colleagues' time just to add on to a few more of those arguments?
Yeah, sure.
So, my colleague raises the important point of what happens when the US changes its position. And, President Trump has consistently held out the option of lifting the sanctions on Huawei as a negotiating chip, which means that he's seen the evidence, or the evidence by from the national security people, and he doesn't believe the case either. And so we have to entertain the notion that the US position on Huawei might change. Its position on China is probably not going to change. That's bipartisan. But its position on Huawei might very well change. And where is that going to leave the UK when it does? So Dr. Tim Stevens made the very interesting point that this is a decision made by a weak government in a weak position, but it was the right political decision. I mean, I think you could argue just as well that this was a decision made by a weak government in a weak position that was exactly the wrong political decision. If you think back to, the war years where the UK really had some very tough choices to make, and it was in a position of strategic weakness vis-a-vis Germany, and it had to make the choice between negotiating an armistice and perhaps having the swastika flying over Westminster, or standing up to Germany, and it decided to stand up to Germany. So it's in these moments of crisis that it's not weak leadership that we need, but we need strong leadership, particularly when the stakes are so stacked against us. So I would like to argue that I think that the Johnson government has let the country down here on this specific political decision. It was the wrong political decision. Thank you.
That was a very interesting argument, Simon. How does Team Tim respond?
Sangi, can I mention a few words? This whole argument seems to have become that this is wholly political in order for the UK government to curry favour with the United States government. And fellow Tim mentioned the whole geopolitical position of the UK at the moment. Well, that's a whole different debate, and we could spend hours going over that. I think that's a major misunderstanding of where the support for this move comes. There's certainly most MPs in the British Parliament, myself included, and particularly on the Labour side, are not particularly interested in currying favour with the US government. This is the right thing to do. We need to stand up to China's abuses of its own population, and increasingly populations beyond Chinese boundaries. And you do that by a multitude of things, including sanctions and including pressures on businesses, where those businesses are in any case clearly linked, whatever Simon might say, to the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. It's absolutely right that we need to stand up to that Chinese influence and misuse of influence. Many of us have been wanting to do that before the current administration in the States, and whatever criticisms, quite right, you may have of the Trump regime and his attitude towards China. And when our own National Cybersecurity Centre identifies Huawei as a high-risk vendor, and that there are security implications for involving it in what is going to be one of the biggest infrastructure projects in this country for next generation telecommunications technology, then it's absolutely right that that needs to come under much closer scrutiny. And I think what everybody has admitted here, and the criticism of the evidence against Huawei, is that it's not clear. But that is part of the problem. There is absolutely no transparency with the way that Huawei operates, its independence, its culpability, and being implicit in the repression that's going on in Xinjiang province or wherever. And for all those reasons, whatever America's position on this may or may not be, most of us in Parliament here do not want to see Huawei have this role in 5G in the future. And frankly, if there's a change of administration in the States and that position changes, though I doubt it, because there is as Tim said, a big bipartisan support for this skepticism towards China. But if the view was to change in the US, I would hope that our view towards Huawei would not change unless Huawei itself has made great strides in being able to prove its independence and its openness to the way it operates, or the Chinese government's own policy on oppressing so many of its own people has changed as well. So it's very cynical, and I just think wrong to say this is all about kowtowing to the Americans. It's about not kowtowing to China.
Can I respond there to a few things?
Yeah, sure, you can respond, Simon, but this has to be our final response.
Okay. Look, I totally agree with Tim Loughton that we need to push back against China. I mean, this is a discussion we're having now in Australia in the context of what we're calling economic coercion, and you know, China, very similar to the US in many ways. China as a sort of emerging hegemon really only understands one language, and that is the naked exercise of power. And because China is an economy and a country and a political system that really doesn't share the values that we hold so dear in the West, means that we do have to be careful, and we do have to stand up to China's abuses. But we don't do that by shooting ourselves in the foot and mortgaging the economic future of our country. When Tim Loughton says that, you know, Huawei is not transparent and needs to be more transparent, look, I would just argue that, you know, Huawei has gone out of its way to be transparent and to set up these cybersecurity evaluation centers, and has opened its doors to Western journalists and to scrutiny far greater than any other Chinese company because it's had to. So I think Tim Loughton is absolutely correct that we need to stand up against China in the sense that it's a country that does not share our own political values. But we also need to ask ourselves, what is the end game here? I mean, what do we want to achieve? Do we want to achieve disengagement from all Chinese companies? Do we want regime change? I think we need to accept that China is what it is, and that is the reality that we have to deal with. And we will do business with Chinese companies to the extent that favors our interests and no more. And, you know, if you take a country's political system or its values as a basis on which to do business with it, then nobody would do business with Saudi Arabia, right? But we do tons of business with Saudi Arabia. We gladly buy their oil, right? And we gladly sell jets to them and defense equipment and things like that. So I think yes, a values-based economic diplomacy is certainly something that we must aspire to, and something we must also implement to the extent that it's compatible with our own economic interests. And I would conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Simon. So it seems as if we've kind of blended round 1 and 2, but that's fine. We'll go on to round 3, which is Q&A. Now, I have received several questions from the audience through the course of the debate, and if you as a speaker disagree with a response given by another speaker to a question, feel free to, you know, refute that as well. Just you know, just as a disclaimer. So my first question for the speakers is, how can we be so sure to avoid a splintering of the internet, as China is doing with their Great Firewall, and ensure a free and open market? Will banning companies like Huawei and TikTok help us to achieve this or stop this? So that's the first question.
Okay, look, let me answer that. I mean, I lived in China, and one of the things that I mean, there are plenty of great things about living in China. I really liked living in China, but one thing I strongly disliked, and it was just the bane of my existence there, was this Great Firewall. And, you know, I would come, you know, like many foreigners there, I came up with all kinds of ways of getting around it. And you know, the Great Firewall has arguably done more damage to China than economically and in terms of innovation than it's benefited China. I think, you know, if we go down the same road and we start banning Chinese companies like the way China has banned Facebook, that risks causing long-term damage to ourselves. And the only real advantage it gives us is it gives us a little bit more leverage in terms of a negotiation based on reciprocity. And you do actually want to come to some sort of terms with China in the sense that their companies will have the same access to Western markets as Western firms enjoy in China, and that is the bottom line. But on the other hand, banning companies that are enriching people's lives and providing valuable services like TikTok really is just another way, and Huawei is really just another way of shooting ourselves in the foot.
Thank you, Simon. Would anyone like to respond to that, or I can just go on to the next question?
Just a very, very brief historical point. I agree with Simon. I don't think banning social media companies or constructing firewalls around your national internet is a particularly useful thing for anybody, not least of which your citizens. But it's worth pointing out that in terms of global governance, fragmentation is the norm rather than the exception. And I think almost all forms of global governance take an awful long time to cohere and to become unified in any meaningful international global sense. So this may just be a phase. And we've had it pretty good so far when it comes to the internet. It's built on a set of common standards and, broadly speaking, a set of common values that have been baked into that technology. We've done all right. But I would also hesitate in just pointing the blame at China, at Russia, and some of its close allies, particularly those in Southeast and Central Asia. We do it all the time by constructing walled gardens and pay products. And we've done a very good job in the West of constructing a very hard to penetrate paywall around all academic output, for example. That's not the infrastructure layer of the internet, but it is one of the layers of the internet. And we need to pay close attention to that and what that's actually doing for the stated values of this global communications medium. But it may just be a phase we're going through, and certainly some long-term thinkers would agree with that. But at the moment, it doesn't. We tried very hard to construct sets of global norms that are, that govern or regulate responsible state behaviour in cyberspace, and we've gone further than many people think. There might be a slight retrenchment at the moment, but let's see where we are in 10 to 20 years' time.
Thank you for that, Dr. Stevens. So I will now go on to the second question, and this one is actually directed towards Simon and Dr. Paul, and it is as follows. Surely banning Huawei isn't like bowing down to Nazi Germany. Allowing Huawei to continue to operate in the UK is like letting Volkswagen sell cars in this country in 1941. China have performed multiple thefts of military secrets and cyber attacks against us and our NATO allies, especially the US.
Paul, do you want to answer that one?
I can certainly have a go at that. That's quite a broad-ranging set of statements there, and you'll have to forgive me for any lack of historical knowledge in relation to these. But no, I don't think you can really compare these things. So yes, there are many allegations against China, particularly the government agencies, but more widely China as a whole, in relation to intellectual property theft. And there could certainly be arguments that there are elements of, probably not Huawei specifically, but many organizations who have built platforms and technologies off stolen technology. I'm sure that happens in China. I'm sure it happens in many other countries. And I would be very surprised if it hasn't happened in the US. And whilst I'd like to think it doesn't happen in the UK, it probably happens there as well. I think what we're facing here is a situation that there's a tendency to see China as an enemy, and that's built on the rhetoric of the US president in particular, and the global political situation, and the fact that perhaps the activities coming out of China, and by no means the only country, we mentioned Russia earlier, has been perhaps detected more coming out of those countries and has been promoted more as coming out of those countries, is perhaps influencing our opinions. Because when talking to colleagues in China, and it's not as if this is talked about openly, but they also see threats from international partners or adversaries who are stealing technology. So it would be very naive to assume that the only technology that's being stolen is the US, the UK, and other allies being taken by those in China. This is a global activity with good and bad players on every side. And so to brand China as being the home of IP theft is unreasonable. It's certainly not justified in terms of any kind of evidence base. I think it's just that we hear more about it. And so to then use that as the basis on which we are implementing controls, restrictions, and in this case bans, wouldn't be appropriate, because we're basing it on a very one-sided set of evidence. Generally, companies in other countries don't talk about their data theft as much as companies in some other countries. And I think in the US, there is that reporting process, same as we have in the UK and Europe. And there is a desire to talk more about these kinds of incidents. In China, from my limited experience, and Simon may know more examples, it doesn't tend to get talked about. It's hushed away. People are not encouraged to broadcast that they have had that kind of theft. So I don't think it's that it's happening purely out of China and attacking the US. I just think that we hear more about the attacks that are allegedly coming out of that and a small number of other countries. Certainly China is amongst one of the top 4 alleged sources of cybercrime as a whole. But it's just that the US doesn't get attributed as much as some other countries, I suspect.
I think the just to add to that, you also need to be cognizant of the fact that Chinese companies used to lead in the creation of IP, and in many areas now, used to follow in the creation of IP, but now increasingly they're leading, and Huawei, is one of the leading innovators, is certainly in the 5G space, and certainly can't be accused of intellectual property theft. But it is a problem with China, receiving on the receiving end of a lot of criticism, and quite rightly so.
Thanks, Simon. Would any of the members of opposition like to respond to that?
No, I think it's right. I mean, we lack good metrics on that particular issue. So I would just sort of put that into the conversation. It's a rather flimsy evidence base. But the thing about the Huawei ban is not principally based on an argument around intellectual property theft. It's based on different issues. So it's a somewhat tangential point.
All right, I guess I'll move on to question 3 now. So this one is for Tim Loughton and Dr. Tim. Is the following. Huawei's 5G is a big deal. It's supposed to be 10 to 100 times faster than 4G. It will provide the framework for future technology such as AI, autonomous cars, etc. By banning 5G, surely we would hamstring our technological progress. Wouldn't other countries look at the UK as a backwards country for choosing to be behind so technologically? And don't UK businesses need Huawei's 5G in order to compete on the post-Brexit global stage?
Shall I take that? I'm not an expert on telecommunications. There seems to be a false conception that Huawei has a monopoly on how we move forward in technology in the future. The UK is not alone. We've seen what's happened in the other countries, the US, Australia, New Zealand, and we see increasing frustration within other EU countries as well. And we are increasingly told that there are other alternatives, be it from the Ericssons, Nokias, and others of this world. I think the question is purely one of time. So I think where the British government did get itself in a bit of a twist, with Boris gushingly saying that we are going to have an oven-ready technology solution, and it's going to be rolled out within the next few nanoseconds. I think at best was overly ambitious. And if it's a question of having a more secure system that we are happier with, and which our partners are happier with, And I think we're going to see more people move across to an alternative to Huawei solution anyway. Then the trade-off is it may take a bit longer. So ultimately, of course, we've got to have the technology that enables us to do all the stuff on AI, autonomous cars, or whatever. I just don't buy the argument that Huawei is the only show in town. It may be the quickest show in town. It's certainly not the only show in town.
Thank you for that, Tim. And would anyone like to respond to that?
I don't know if Simon's happy to make a start, but certainly I'd like to say that you're quite correct. No one member flags that Huawei is definitely not the only show in town. There are competitors, there are other alternatives, including others from within China, which I'm sure would not be considered as part of any UK rollout. But whilst there may be competitors, you are right that they're not going to deliver the same impact, the same benefits within the same timescales. And as I sort of flagged earlier, we're only shifting the focus from a Chinese control, or at least perceived control, from the Chinese Communist Party over Huawei. And again, there's no evidence underlying that, but there's that concern. Are we not simply replacing it with another manufacturer's set of devices that potentially could be under generation's control? So the idea that moving to a European solution, we're going through that process of Brexit. Is that going to then influence the relationships and the partnerships that we have? And it's just going to build to a fresh set of challenges with a different set of suppliers to shift away from what is currently the leading provider of communications platforms globally to a second or third rate provider, currently based on their perception within the market. Seems like it's a big ask for relatively little gain. And from what Dr. Stevens was saying, predominantly purely on a political basis, not on a technical one, not on a national security one, not on a cyber security front. These are fundamentally being made as political decisions.
The other factor there, if I could just chime in, is not just that Huawei is the most technologically advanced and the most cost competitive, but also the fact that build out of 5G is going to be based on existing 4G networks, and operators have relied very, very heavily on Huawei for the rollout of 4G. And they're very comfortable with Huawei. They like Huawei. They trust Huawei. And these are the companies that know their networks best, and they understand the risks most poignantly. And so if you're going to force them to go with less competitive and less technologically advanced vendors, that's also going to impose a cost on their legacy infrastructure. And so that's just another cost that we need to take into consideration.
Thank you for that, Simon. And we are coming towards the end of time now, so why don't we have our final vote? If you still agree with the ban on Huawei, put yes into the chat. If you disagree, type no. And if you're still unsure, type in unsure. And while I wait for Alex to tally up the votes for me, I have actually just received another question. So we'll do that in the meantime. So the next question is, even if Huawei is unlikely to spy on the UK, surely it's not worth taking the risk because the consequences could be so dire. Do the pros of having Huawei really outweigh the consequences, such as China being able to spy on the UK?
Look, I would like to say to that that this question came up during the telecom infrastructure review last year, and it's also a question that's come up in the context of COVID-19 in terms of the question is systemic resilience, right? And so obviously in the 5G space, because this is critical infrastructure, the risks are much greater than they were in a 4G world. But as the parliamentary inquiry conceded, the safety of future 5G networks in the UK is not going to come down to the existence of one vendor coming from one country. It's going to be an all of network sort of issue. And so if you build a network that can be brought to its knees by one vendor, then you fail to do a significantly good job of protecting the network. And that's not the way networks are going to be designed. Now, Huawei never argued for more than sort of a third market share. Huawei's always been in favor of a multi-vendor strategy because it sees the benefits of that in terms of cybersecurity. And so I think, of course, there are greater risks in a 5G world, but the reality of global supply chains in the ICT industry is that it's not just Huawei's equipment that's made in China. Nokia and Ericsson also manufacture in China. Basically, all roads lead through China, and so that is really not the way you go about mitigating these risks by banning one company or another just because of their flag of origin.
Would anyone like to add anything to that response?
Can I just make the simple point here? What this really flags up is what a wrong decision it was, although a passive one, to lose our national telecommunications capacity. I mean, it was only 20 years ago or so. There were many top global UK-based companies in telecommunications who were leading the way in this technology, who all got then gobbled up by other global players, and manufacturing and intellectual capability got offshored as well. If there's one good thing that needs to come out of this, we need to have greater independence of capacity to develop this technology, either in the UK or between the UK and trusted partners. But I come back to the original point as well, that we don't know if we can trust Huawei. It lacks that transparency, but we just need to be standing up to China and its offshoots, of which I'm afraid Huawei, if you really do look at the structure of it, is one. China has got to be called out. Standing up to China in Huawei may be a political decision, but it's a decision that, frankly, we should have taken more seriously years ago.
All right, thank you for that, Tim. And I do have the results of the vote here. And I actually forgot to mention at the start, but the team that wins today will not be the team that has the most votes. It will actually be the team that's managed to gain the most new votes. So in other words, it will be the most minds. So the results of the initial vote, the one that we had at the start, and these were votes that were sent to the Southampton page as well as put in the live stream chat. So we had 10 votes for yes, as in we support the ban, 5 votes for no, opposition to the ban, and 3 for unsure. Now that the debate has ended, the final votes are as follows. We have 9 for yes, 3 for no, and 6 for unsure. So it looks like
unsure wins.
Unsure wins, yeah. I mean, I can't blame anyone. It is a really contentious topic, and we have just, spent a lot of time shedding light on the gray areas, the nuances. So I don't blame people for not coming to a definitive decision, but I can work out the winner in another way. So both sides have lost votes to unsure. However, yes, as in proposing the ban, has lost 1 vote, but no has lost 2 votes. Which means that the winner of the debate will have to be Team Tim. So
it's a victory for the home side. Yep, they changed their mind.
Yeah.
Congratulations, guys.
Well done.
It's a victory for Tim globally.
I mean, that's a really, really interesting outcome, and it doesn't surprise me at all. When we have these conversations in the classroom and we set up these oppositions, pro and con, on this specific issue, it's an incredibly complex issue. And around foreign policy, around ethics and values, around economics, around the whole political economy of global communications, around standards. And then, as I've been banging on about the politics and geopolitics of it, which we can't possibly scratch the surface. And it just goes to show how difficult decision making is in this space. And I actually have a great deal of sympathy for decision makers around this particular issue, particularly when the squeeze is being put on them by very, very close geopolitical allies, and particularly when they've made election promises that they're now going to find difficult to fulfill. The costs of other vendors are going to have to be passed on to consumers. It's going to take longer. And it just shows how really, really complex and difficult it is to make firm decisions on an issue that is not black and white. And there's many, many competing interests and positions that we might take on this. But thank you for a very enlivening conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aggie.
No worries, everyone. So that was the debate. Again, thank you all for coming here, especially the speakers. In the UK here, it's almost noon, but that might as well be 6 a.m. for the typical student. So thank you to the audience as well. And that's it. I guess we can end the live stream now. Thanks, everyone, and goodbye.